So good afternoon, folks. Want to thank you so much for joining us for NAMI Maryland's 40th annual conference. My name is Bill Fluke. I'm a volunteer with NAMI Maryland. I'll be your moderator for this session today. This workshop session is Suicide Prevention Safety Planning, the what, why, and how. And it's presented by Taryn Gauthier from the United States Department of Veteran Affairs. You can read more about our amazing presenters, including their full bios, in the digital conference program on the conference website. We are very excited for you to join us for a discussion with Taryn Gauthier, a member of the VA Maryland Suicide Prevention Team, that will focus on what safety planning is. How do we use safety planning for suicide prevention? An overview of the what, why, and how for safety planning, and other creative ways that we can keep the environment safe for those that we care about, as well as ourselves. If this isn't the workshop you meant to attend, please click the button on your browser, click on sessions on the left-hand side to return to the full list. Now, I want to make it clear that many of you may have questions. We're going to be addressing questions at the end of this presentation. If you have any questions, as the presentation continues, please post them in the Q&A. There's different buttons. There's a chat and a Q&A. Q&A is what I'll be looking for when you have questions on the right side of your screen. If you have technical challenges, please post those in the chat and we'll help you with those. We'll review questions as they come in, and if something is unclear, we'll follow up after the presenter has completed their presentation. We're pleased to offer closed captioning for this year's conference. Captioning is only available for attendees using a desktop. Down at the bottom of your screen, there's a CC, which you can click on. When you click on that, the video displays will be a little smaller, but you'll see the captions. If you have any comments, concerns, please use the chat. I'd like to welcome our presenter for today's workshop, Taryn Gauthier. Thank you for joining us.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Taryn. I am a social worker at the Veterans Administration. I actually work at the Maryland VA and the Baltimore. I'm housed in Baltimore, but really we serve all of Maryland and just kind of rotate cases based on when they come in. So I'm quite excited to be here today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because looking at myself is distracting. So one second. All right. Please let me know if you can see my slides. Can someone just confirm?
Yes.
Okay, great. So why am I here today? So specifically what I will be talking about today is what is called the safety planning intervention. It was developed by Dr. Stanley and Brown. And what this means is that they've developed a way in which we can help clients, and pardon me, because I may say veterans a lot, I'm going to try to say clients as much as possible, so that we can help clients and loved ones understand what exactly happens when we may be entering into a crisis moment and our risk to act on the thoughts of suicide is increasing. And we might at that point be having urges to act on those thoughts of suicide. And so what can we do so that when that happens, there is basically a plan ahead of time of what to do? Now, historically, people may have been taught to do any sort of like signing a contract, that they contract for safety. And what we've seen in the research is that there actually isn't any evidence to support that that is effective. And so the good news, though, is that what we do have is evidence to support that this intervention does, in fact, lead to a decrease in suicidal behaviors and attempts. So that being said, I want to give credit where credit is due. This is not my intervention that I put together. This is put together by Gregory Brown, Barbara Stanley, and Wendy Batdorf. So what they did was they put together a training called the Advanced Training in Safety Planning Intervention. And then there are different consultants that are rolling this out to different sites at the VA. I'm one of the consultants, and this is just a little bit of information on the program. Given the amount of time we have, not going to go too much in this, but I want to give the credit where the credit is due. And then talk about what our goal is. So what I want to talk about is the rationale for the safety planning. I'll touch briefly on the evidence. I might need you to either trust me a little bit or reference the slides after the training, just for time, and then give you an overview of what the intervention looks like. And keep in mind that I'm saying the word intervention. This is not a quick thing that we have someone do. This is not a something we just, give to the client to fill out a safety plan and then they're good to go and they take it. We now see that the research supports that if this is done collaboratively with our client as an intervention, so likely taking like 40 minutes to an hour, that this is how we have found these to be effective. So you'll hear me using the term intervention a lot, and that is why. Important thing to note, this does not replace someone going through the advanced safety planning intervention training. I'm just doing a brief overview, kind of giving some background information. If you are interested, you can reach out to myself if you're with the VA, but if you are not, I can point you to Wendy Batdorf, who would be able to follow up on questions on potentially how training could happen outside of the VA. All right, safety planning intervention. So before I get started, I want you guys to just think for a second. When I say safety planning, and you don't have to answer, but just kind of think about it, what comes to mind when you think clinician doing safety plan with clients? And then we'll go ahead through and we'll talk about what it is, or what this specific one is and what we mean by that. All right, so these next couple slides are talking about the evidence to support this, but what I want to say in the because of time is that there is evidence to support that when these safety plans are done correctly, and they're done in a robust manner, and they're done in a way that is collaborative with the client, and you are doing them as they are designed to be done, there is evidence to support that they decrease the likelihood of clients acting on those thoughts of suicide by engaging in any sort of preparatory behavior or making a suicide attempt. So this is an evidence-based intervention that we are rolling out as well. There are also variations for different communities. So the LGBTQ community, Native folks, rural folks, older veterans, veterans with substance abuse, those who've experienced trauma, and female veterans. Of note, the rollout of the training came about in 2019. And when we realized that having a proper training for the safety planning, having consultation options with an actual person training you, having different portions of the training where you are role playing or listening to other role plays and interacting with one another, that having that whole combination of options together was the best way that we've found to train someone to be able to then provide this intervention to folks. All right, so when we say safety planning intervention, this is what we mean. Now, the safety plan itself, there's more added to it, but this is kind of one of the examples that we have. So it's broken down, and I'll go through all of this. Warning signs, meaning how can we tell when a crisis is building within you so that you know to pull out your safety plan? Then what internal coping strategies can we do by yourself to try to get through that crisis moment to a place where thoughts of suicide are no longer present or they're more manageable? So internal coping strategies and distractions, people and social settings that can serve as distractions, people who you can open up to and ask for help if the others are not working, professionals and agencies you can reach out to, the crisis hotline. You'll see this is an older format, so 988 is not on here. Local emergency services, and then making the environment safe. So before we go into what this looks more like, I want to explain more about the rationale of why we're doing this, because I know there's a lot of misconceptions about suicide risk that lead to us perhaps not asking the question or being fearful that, if someone wants to do it, they're going to do it. Or there's people who talk about it and there's people who do it. And interestingly enough, from those who have survived suicide attempts, the research has shown that none of that is actually accurate. And so what we want to be doing is understanding what suicide risk looks like so that we can be talking about it, so we can be asking the question, are you thinking about killing yourself? Have you been thinking about killing yourself? And what can we do to help prepare you for the next time that perhaps a crisis moment arises and you're having those urges to act on the thoughts of suicide? All right, I'm going to breeze over the research, not because it doesn't matter. I love research, but for time. So there are two ways that we talk about suicide risk that we try to assess for. We want to understand what someone's chronic risk is, meaning over their lifetime, what is the likelihood that when they are in crisis or when they are in distress, that basically their brain might generate thoughts of suicide. So over the lifespan, what's their risk? And sometimes you think, like, some of the things that we take into account would be prior suicide attempts, a trauma history, any sort of mental health diagnoses, losing someone you love to suicide, and then basically what has happened in the past when they're in distress. So we kind of take a lot of that into account to look at what is their chronic risk. What you'll see here, this description is basically showing that over time throughout a lifespan, the risk for human beings can persist, right? There's some people who just throughout the lifespan are at risk of suicide. The other way the additional way that we look at it, so we look at chronic and we also look at acute. So right in this, current period of time, what is the likelihood that this person is going to act on those thoughts of suicide currently? I don't have time to go into assessing or training on how to do all that. If at any point any of you are interested in us training on that, we would love to come out and do that. But I want to give kind of the main overview of what acute risk actually looks like. So if you think about someone who either isn't having thoughts of suicide when they wake up in the morning, or someone who perhaps is always thinking about suicide, but not at a point in which they have the urge to act on it. So if you take a look at this graph, this is what if there's anything that you take away today, please let it be this portion right here. So if you want to listen up as best you can, and let me know if you have any questions. So this graph right here shows what we think of when we think of what someone's acute risk for suicide looks like. So you'll see on the y-axis, the up and down axis is risk. So how much risk is there to act on those thoughts of suicide? How intense is that urge, or is the urge building? And then on the x-axis, you have time. So as time goes on, what does the risk look like? So in terms of acute risk, what we know is that what tends to happen is that typically some sort of stressor will happen say, I lost my mouse, so I don't know. I was going to show if we're trying to kind of walk across, think of it as walking across this arc, this arrow throughout the day. Think of that because we're talking time. So there is some sort of stressor, and it may lead to, feeling overwhelmed. And then say another hour passes and you reach out to someone you care about, and they end up, for whatever reason, maybe they break up with you, right? So now not only are you feeling overwhelmed, but now you're feeling perhaps alone with what you're going through. And then maybe that triggers some other intense thoughts for you, such as, I'm never going to be able to get through this, or I'm just sick of all the suffering. I can't do this anymore. I've had enough. And so what we see is that over time, and literally we're talking minutes, hours, that your risk for suicide is increasing. And what happens is that you tend to get to this peak point, which is where the arrow is pointing, where you're at risk of acting on those thoughts of suicide. So perhaps that impulsive desire to act on it is now arising. But then whether you make an attempt and survive, or you don't make an attempt, what we tend to see, or what we do see, is that you can't be stuck in that high, intense moment where you have the urge for very long. Most people tend to, that period of time is only like 30 minutes. So as time goes on, naturally what we see is that our risk starts to decrease. So whether that's because we said, we decided that we're going to reach out to a friend, we spoke to them and they said, don't worry about him, things will be okay, we got this, you're going to get through it. So then you're, as time's going on, like say now it's been 30 minutes, your risk is decreasing a little bit. Like you're starting to feel like, okay, maybe I don't need to do this right now. Maybe I can get through it. So then as time goes on, maybe in the next hour, you go back home and you turn on a movie and you're watching Elf, and you're noticing that, or what we tend to see is that as you continue with any sort of distractions or just time in general, that risk continues to decrease. So the reason this is so critical is because what we know is that thoughts of suicide come and go. And or the thoughts of suicide that are intense and lead to the desire to act on them come and go. That the crisis often passes. And this is just a visual of that. This arc, this suicide risk curve that we call it, could be all in a total of an hour, right? So 10 a.m. at the beginning of the curve, maybe it's like 11:30 at the end of the curve. And there was that crisis moment. So what the purpose of our safety plan is to, ahead of time, come up with a game plan for all the things that you could do to get yourself from one side of the curve to the other without acting on those urges to kill yourself. And so they've done research to understand what kinds of things can help that crisis to pass, because we know it passes. So what kinds of things help? And that's what is broken down in the safety plan. Now, I also want to clarify. So the safety plan is not treating the underlying struggles that are generating the thoughts of suicide. This is for the acute moments where you have an urge. Because if we lose you in the process, we can't continue to work on the underlying drivers of what may be leading you to want to kill yourself. So we want to keep you alive in those crisis moments that we see can tend to come and go and come up, so that we can continue treating the underlying struggles. All right. Normally I'd ask questions, but we're going to do that at the end. Feel free to type them in the chat so you don't forget. Okay, so some assumptions that we then have found benefits of the safety planning assisting with. So one assumptions, individuals may have trouble recognizing when a crisis is beginning to occur. That is why we talked about, or what you'll see we go into that first section of the safety plan is what are your personal warning signs so that you can get more aware of when a crisis is arising, what body sensations tend to correlate with going into crisis, what specific thoughts, as specific as if you start to have the thought, I'm never going to be able to get into a healthy relationship, or everyone's always going to leave me, trying to really figure out those, those specific thoughts ahead of time so that you can be mindful of them and know when to pull out your safety plan. Another assumption, problem solving and coping skills diminish during emotional and suicidal crises. This applies to all of us. When we are flooded with emotion, we don't tend to problem solve well. So this is why we're doing this ahead of time and not just saying, are you able to commit to not harming yourself and killing yourself over the weekend, right? We want to be encouraging them to utilize this so they have ways to work through something if it arises over the weekend. We want to add it in so they can navigate a crisis when it arises. Say it, later tonight when you wake up with a nightmare after going to bed and waking back up. So if we have it ahead of time, we are more likely, A, to use it, and B, get through that crisis. And the final assumption we have on here, so safety planning is a clinical intervention in that the provider and the patient work together to determine the most helpful coping strategies and resources. This part is also critical. We're not just saying one distraction could be, I could read a book. We are making this way more individualized than that. We are thinking about, if you say reading is helpful to distract you in these crisis moments, what book do you think would be the most helpful? Where could you read the book? Would you use your iPad, or do you have a hard copy version? And then literally writing on the safety plan that very specific plan for reading that book that is individualized to this client. So they're individualized, they're feasible. So we're not saying things like, we want to make sure we're also having things on there that are 24 hours, or not putting on there, I can go hiking, and that being one of our only things on there, given that you may live in Baltimore City and you mean driving 2 hours. We want to be talking about, in these crisis moments, realistic things that you can be doing in order to distract yourself or cope with some of the intense emotions that are arising. And then things that are easy to use. So that kind of touches on the same thing I was saying. Those are more, and as a result of doing it that way, it's found that it's more likely to be effective in reducing the suicide risk during the crisis. Because remember, and I'm going to keep referencing the curve throughout, I want that to be how we are framing our understanding of suicide risk which is these crisis moments that tend to arise. So we want a safety plan to be able to help us get to the other side of that crisis, the other side of that wave, without attempting to kill ourselves or harm ourselves. This just touches on more data, and more data here that was done in the ER showing the impact of the safety planning intervention. And then also how Joint Commission picked this up as a necessity for the VA based on the research, and now it's required. Oops, sorry, I didn't mean to click forward that quickly. All right. If you have any questions about the why or what, you can go ahead and enter it now, and then we're going to switch into a Actually, now we're switching into what it actually is. What does it look like? How do we do it? Give you just a second. If there's any questions you want to enter. Okay. Check the time. All right, we're doing good with timing. So when we think about the safety planning intervention, these are the 6 steps that we put into it. So first, you want to be identifying the risk and assessing for it. There's different ways in which you can do that. At the VA, we use what's called the Columbia Suicide Severity Risk Scale. And then we also use a comprehensive suicide risk evaluation, which is more robust if that the original Columbia is positive. So we want to be identifying and assessing risk. And then we start moving into the intervention. So the first portion is obtaining information on the most recent suicidal crisis that the person was in. Not just the last time they had thoughts of suicide, but the last time that they had thoughts of suicide with the urge to act on it and either attempted or considered attempting. So we want to go back to that day. So we're going to ask them to fully walk through that with us so we can start to see what really goes on for that specific person. What were some of the warning signs in your body? What were some of the warning signs that were thoughts that tend to be the ones that lead to those thoughts of suicide? Any intense emotions that tend to really correlate with having that urge to kill yourself. So we're going to try to gather some of that information from the most recent crisis and then brainstorm some more. So obtaining the crisis, then we're explaining the safety plan. Then we're going to complete the safety plan with them. And that's the majority of what I'll be talking about today. And then having the client implement the safety plan. So try using it, and then we follow up with them. So at the next session, were you able to use your safety plan? What got in the way? Did it feel like it was going to be helpful? Any barriers? Anything you tried that wasn't helpful that we can remove, and anything we need to add? So we're seeing the safety plan as a living document that we are looking at, working with, utilizing, and enhancing every single session. All right, I'm gonna not go into identifying and assessing risk because that is its own hour-long training. Again, if that's something that you are interested in getting more information on, please reach out to us, and we will be able to come out and support and try to help with that. Let me click through. So I will note this. So the Research Center for the VA has created a risk stratification table to show the ways in which we can determine risk and stratify risk for folks. The one on the left you'll see is how to stratify acute risk, and the one on the right is how to stratify chronic risk. If you go to the MIREC website, MIRECC, through the VA, go to the Rocky Mountain MIREC. They're out in Denver. That's where they do all of our suicide research. You'll be able to find a lot of this information there. Or if you have any follow-up questions about it, you can just reach out. Okay, obtaining the crisis narrative. So I'm going to break down what that actually looks like, because this is also what makes this more of an intervention as opposed to just coming up with some coping skills and having like a coping skill sheet. Because we're going to get the information from them from their most recent crisis that they were in. So the goals are to describe how to help veterans focus on a specific suicidal crisis and feel understood. Describe how to help veterans identify the events, such as triggers, and their personal warning signs that indicate the beginning or escalation of a crisis, and describe how to help veterans understand that suicidal risk increases and then decreases over time, which does provide us with this opportunity to find ways to cope with the crisis, to get to the other side of that crisis, that curve, that wave, without harming ourselves or attempting to kill ourselves. So I don't need to go through this. You're like, when you're getting the narrative, you really just want to break down exactly what happened, asking as many questions as you can, looking into what some of the triggers were, body sensations, thoughts, emotions that were arising, and how it was building. And then also what happened at that peak moment when you were ready to act on it or you were considering acting on it. Did you? And then what happened? And continuing to ask, and then what happened, getting more and more info until you can tell from the narrative that they were back down to either a space where they no longer had thoughts of suicide or had thoughts of suicide, but they were more manageable. They no longer had that urge to act on it. Maybe they got to a point where they were like, actually, maybe now's not the time. Or I actually don't want to kill myself. I was just feeling stuck, and I'm glad I didn't. There's going to be a whole array of what people are feeling afterward. But you want to be asking the whole narrative of the crisis. And I believe there's a slide showing an example. And another purpose of this is helping show that when a crisis was building, like on that left side of the curve as the crisis was building, the sooner that we pull out our safety plan and utilize skills and distractions to get through it, the easier it actually is. Like if you're trying to protect yourself at that peak moment when you're about to harm yourself, that's much more challenging. It is doable, right? We have emergency contacts on the crisis, on the safety plan. But you can see that crises tend to build. Oftentimes people feel like it just happens really quickly. But as we slow down with someone and find out what happened that day, we can start to see that actually there was a buildup and be more in touch with what our buildup looks like so we can act on that sooner to pull out our safety plan. Okay. That's just another visual of the suicide risk curve. And then the next slide, I believe, should be someone mapping onto it what that would look like. There we go. So here's an example of what the amount of information that you're getting on. So you find out that the person is saying their supervisor was critical of them. Maybe you ask, okay, what kind of thoughts were coming up? Then they realized they were thinking everything is falling apart. And so they started to drink and got into an argument with their spouse. Okay, then what happened? What kinds of thoughts were coming up then? Then I started thinking, I can't take it anymore. I'm absolutely helpless. And maybe it would just be easier if I ended it. Okay, so then what happened? Because you're here. So then what happened? Well, I put a loaded gun to my chin, but I didn't pull the trigger. So what happened? Like, what led to not pulling the trigger? Well, my friend called and it interrupted me. And I told everything, and my friend took me to the ER. Okay, what do you remember thinking then? When you were headed to the ER or once you were at the ER, I started thinking that actually I don't want to die. That was just a really intense situation and it felt awful, but actually I don't want to die. And I might also ask, like, what emotions were there as well in that moment. So some people may say, like, then I actually started to feel a little bit of relief that I didn't have to die. Or I felt, maybe now's not the time. So there was relief that I didn't have to harm anyone right now. And I'm not ruling it out that I'll never do it. But for now, I'm no longer considering it. Or I'm no longer having the urge to act on it. And there's a relief there. So when we're doing this safety planning intervention, we are starting by asking them how they're doing, asking them about this most recent suicide crisis that they went through, explaining the suicide risk curve and mapping their experience onto it. And then we're introducing the safety plan. So we're showing them this soon. If you notice that when your supervisor was critical and you were starting to have those thoughts that everything is falling apart, if we had this safety plan in place ahead of time, that could have been a time that perhaps we could have utilized it. So let's come up with a whole set of things that we can do in those moments to help you get to the other side of here and not be at risk of killing yourself. And then you may say that when you do it ahead of time, it's much more effective because it's hard to brainstorm in that moment when you're in that crisis. Our brains just don't do very well, coming up with great ideas. If you've ever been in a fight with anybody, is a great example of how we don't do a great job of talking through our options with somebody if we are very elevated. And by fight, I mean conflict. I do not mean physical altercation, to be clear. All right. So we're going to introduce the safety plan. We're going to do the safety plan. Important to note, we're not simply giving it to them to fill out. We are letting them know we're going to do this collaboratively. We're going to go through it together. I'm going to try to help you brainstorm ideas. And if you're struggling to come up with anything, I can assist. And then we're going to make sure that these are things you'd actually do. And you're not just putting it on there because you feel pressure to, because I'm asking you to, right? If you're not going to do it, I'm going to erase it off the safety plan. This is for you. I want this to be realistic for you so that if you get an awful call at the end of this day tonight and you start having those thoughts of suicide, that you have an urge to act on it, that you have a safety plan of things that you can do to try to help you through that crisis. So warning signs. I talked a bit about this. Really, what are your cues that it would be time to pull out your safety plan? Any specific thoughts that tend to lead to the desire to die, such as there's absolutely no hope, things are never going to get better, I'm alone in this world, nothing matters. Like, what are some of those very specific thoughts that tend to lead to a desire to kill yourself or that urge to kill yourself? Any specific emotions, such as like intense hopelessness or loneliness? What things truly trigger those desires to kill yourself? And then any behaviors that tend to correlate to it, or any warning signs. Or any triggers in your environment. And then as well, any physical sensations. So some people may say, if they struggle with chronic pain, like I was already having my chronic pain in my back, but then I also started to get a migraine. And then I just felt like life is not worth living. And so we can break that down and kind of see what parts of those are warning signs that you should pull out your safety plan. The more specific, the more likely they are to notice it in the moment and pull out the safety plan. Because if you just say, when I get sad, well, do you think of suicide every time you're sad? And if they say no, okay, so what is it when you're sad that then leads to that desire to kill yourself? Oh, well, it's when I start telling myself that I'm not good enough while I'm sad. So then we'll put that on the safety plan. And we want to ask for feedback after we generate the warning signs. Are these things that you think would truly help you realize that you need to pull out your safety plan? If not, let's keep brainstorming. So we want to review each section. Step 2 are internal coping strategies. So one thing that we know is that distraction is incredibly helpful for getting that urge or like helping get to the other side of that crisis without acting on the urge. So steps 2 and 3 are both forms of distractions. So internal coping strategies, if it's literally just you, or when we're coming up with examples of things you can do just by yourself on your own, that's the first step. What would those be? So why do we do this? We want to help people know that they can distract themselves in these moments and that they can get through the crisis. It can empower them to cope with the urges on their own, a greater sense of autonomy and self-efficacy and control, so that there's a feeling of, when this crisis happens, I might actually be able to help myself through it, which is extremely helpful and important in feeling like you have some sort of control over this risk. You want to provide the rationale, you want to generate the internal coping strategies, and then you want to review that section. Are these things you would actually do? So we want to think of things that are highly distracting, individualized and specific, feasible, do not involve other people. So this wouldn't be going to the gym. This is literally, if it's just you with no human interaction, what would it be? So maybe working out at home, but the gym, what you would see other people potentially. So that would be in a separate section. Right, so end of each section, you ask for feedback. Is this something you'd likely do? If not, let's take it off and let's come up with something else. And if people can only come up with 1 or 2 things, try your best, but we don't want to shame people for struggling to come up with options or make them feel like they're not going to be okay. Try to think of some options, and then we just share that we can add on to it as they do other things in therapy. But it can be as simple as, like, I can watch puppies play on YouTube. I can watch, I can pull up stand-up comedy and watch X person do something. All right, next step. So if you notice your warning signs, you pull out your safety plan and you notice that you're using your internal coping strategies and they're not working, then move on to social contacts and social settings. Again, we only want to be having them put down things they're actually willing to do. So some examples, you want to make these more specific, but some examples would be a coffee shop, a park, a gym, a mall, and then break it down more. So which coffee shop, how would you get there? Where is it? So I could go to Others Coffee on 5th and Main and I would walk there. I want that whole sentence on that safety plan as opposed to go to a coffee shop, because we don't want people having to come up with things in that moment that they need to figure out what they're going to do, what coffee shop, because that can be enough to be too overwhelming to continue working on figuring it out. So what places can you go to help take your mind off of what's going on? Remember, distraction can be fantastic for getting to the other side of that crisis and no longer being in a space where you're wanting to act on the thoughts of suicide. Get feedback. Oh, so also, who can you reach out to that's a distraction? So places that are a distraction and people that are a distraction. So even if it's someone where they talk a lot, right? Like you call a friend and they're the person that's just going to ramble. If you're open to that, who would that person be? Or someone you can just kind of use as a distraction in that moment. Now, we're going through these steps in order. So say you do your internal coping strategies and it does not help. You're still having those urges to act on the thoughts of suicide. You try calling your friend and he's, kind of sharing about his update with his life. And you also go to 7-Eleven just to kind of peruse around the aisles. And that's still not enough. You're still having this desire to act on those thoughts of suicide, or you feel that crisis is still building. Who then can you reach out to open up? Who do you trust to say, I'm having a hard time, these thoughts of suicide are coming up, can you talk? So who would those people be? That's a different section. It can be the same as the social support in the one before, but first you're trying distraction, then you're opening up. And then you want to ask about, would you actually call these folks? And do you think that it would be helpful? If not, I'm going to erase it. We don't need to, actually it wouldn't be erased. I'd probably delete it because I'm doing it on a computer. But if not, let's take it off, because again, this is not for me. This is for you. So if you're not going to call, I'm not going to put it on here so that I feel better because you have more people on your safety plan. This is supposed to be legit, realistic for you. Who would you actually call? And if there's no one, that is okay. You're trying to generate options while not simultaneously like accidentally shaming someone and making them feel like without someone, they won't be okay. And we want to talk about sharing the safety plan with others, but I'll get back to that in a second. Step 5, say you reach out to your best friend and you say you're having those thoughts of suicide and you're trying to talk through it and it's not working. What professionals can you reach out to? And would you actually call them? If you're not going to call them, I'm not going to put that on there. Like if you feel confident that, yeah, you have a psychiatrist, but you would never call them, we're not putting it on there just to make myself, the clinician, feel better. I'm not going to put it on there. I'll put the crisis hotline. I'll put 911, any other sort of emergency resources, but I'm not just going to put people on there so that I feel better as the provider. I want to make this a very real plan for you. We want to review the Veterans Crisis Hotline because that will be on there. Other emergency services. So if you have any mobile crisis teams in the county, if you want to put that down, if they're in a specific county that has that, 988, 911, any emergency options that they're open to. It's more on the crisis hotline. Putting down the closest ER that they'd go to or the closest urgent care so that they don't have to think about it in the moment. If someone's willing to take them, they can just say, this is the one I'm comfortable with going to. And then any barriers to reaching out for help. You want to discuss that. I'm not going to skip over it quickly to undermine it. I'm skipping it over quickly so that I can get to the last portion so that we can have time for questions. All right, final step, making your environment safe. So I said at the beginning that there are, do I have the risk curve on here? So I said at the beginning, the risk curve is the thing that if you only remember one thing, I want it to be this idea that we know that thoughts of suicide come and go, that though they may have thoughts of suicide, that urge to act on it, that peak portion of the risk curve tends to be very short, minutes to an hour, majority of the time. And so the purpose of also highlighting that is that if we can make it so that when someone's having the urge, they literally cannot access lethal means, then we will have saved their life that time. We know that most people, when they make a suicide attempt, they don't go on to make another. So if we can keep that person alive in that moment, we are likely saving their life for the rest of their time here. However, if they continue to have those urges again in the future, we can continue with this safety planning and getting them involved in treatment that's treating those underlying things that are generating the desire to kill themselves. There's a word for it, and it's not coming to my mind. The drivers, that's the word. All right, so making the environment safe. This is critical, very critical, because we know that window of time is very short. We also know that people do not tend to, so if someone has access to a firearm, and that's the method that they've decided at one point that would be what they would want to do, what we actually see from survivors is that when people try to access it and are not able to, rarely do people go look for another means? Because what tends to happen is that time passes, that crisis starts de-escalating, and they no longer are interested in acting on it, either again or right then. And so you really are saving that life in that moment. And it is one of the most effective public health level interventions that we can do, is talk about access to lethal means. So firearms, opiates, or the means that this particular person has considered using. So if it's driving off of a bridge, safety planning around that. How can we be as creative as possible to limit your access in those risk moments? I've had a client that was willing to give her keys to her husband when she got home every day, because being at home was when those thoughts really started to come up, and she would have the desire to go into her car and drive to a bridge. So because she wasn't in that acute crisis when we spoke, she did want to stay alive. She just knows there are times when I don't. And so she's willing to protect herself now from those times later that are likely to arise for her. So she was willing to give her husband the keys. Or putting pictures of your loved ones that make you want to live in your car or on your keychain. Placing things in the environment that are your reasons for living, and having that discussion with them as well. I will say this section is where we have to be the most creative. Like if you have let's see, I've had someone who had excess pills and they couldn't flush them down the toilet. So they were able to put them in a jar of peanut butter and then throw the peanut butter, like bring the peanut butter out to the dumpster. Just like anything you can think of that puts time and space in between the urge to kill yourself and the ability to do it. Even if it's 30 seconds. Just storing your ammo separately from your firearm has been shown to decrease the likelihood that someone dies by suicide. Because even taking that 30 seconds to go to the other room to grab your ammo can be enough time for your brain to either get distracted by something else and realize, wait, what am I doing? Or to start thinking about your loved ones, or whatever the reason is. If it's your pet, if that's the only reason you feel like you want to be here, maybe when you walk to get your ammo, you see your dog, and that can be enough time. Ideally, you're removing the lethal means, but that's not always realistic, and it's not always something people are willing to do. So we want to get as creative as possible. And just keep in mind that it is very, very challenging to get yourself to kill yourself. So the reason I'm saying that is those windows where you're willing to act on it tend to be very impulsive, because the brain is designed to stay alive. So it's very hard for the brain to stay in self-destruct mode to take its own life for very long. So if we can keep you safe in those short moments by making the environment more safe, we can save your life. And ideally, we're also doing the full safety plan to catch it sooner. And you're getting the support that might be leading to you having the desire to kill yourself in the first place. But we can't lose you in the process, or we won't be able to get you to that space where you're wanting to have this, or you're living a life that is worth living for you. This should be... There's more breakdown about access to firearms, all of that. I'll let you go through it if you'd like to. We also do whole trainings on lethal means safety, which is that whole last section that I was talking about. That in and of itself can be an hour long. And remembering, where are you going to store your safety plan? Do you want multiple copies of it so you can remember it exists, like having it on next to your bed? Is there anyone you can share it with, that when you reach out to them, they can support you and take a look at the safety plan? And then letting them know how to use it. So you're going in order, unless you are at a place where you are feeling unsafe and that you're going to kill yourself. You can obviously go straight to 911. You don't have to start with internal coping strategies. So letting people know that if step 2 doesn't work, go on to step 3. If 3 doesn't work, go on to step 4. However, you can skip entirely straight to 911. And I think that's going to be it for this, because I know it's only 5 minutes for questions, but at least we can get some.
Taryn, that was a fantastic. That was so powerful. I really, there's a lot that's gone into this. Very helpful, very, very interesting. At this point, we have one question, and I'm going to read it. And although it doesn't have any thumbs ups with it, I would give it a thumbs up, because this is my area as a retired school psychologist. Is there a version of this intervention to use with children, adolescents, and young adults? And obviously, many veterans are young adults. But if so, does anyone?
That was going to be my initial thought. Yep.
Yeah. Does anyone in the VA offer training for its use, or can you steer us someplace for that? It's a great question, and I want to.
Yeah, that's an incredible question. That was the only question that I was feeling like, if someone asked me, I actually don't have the answer. I'm definitely going to be steering you to someone. So the woman who pretty much runs the advanced safety planning intervention, her name is Wendy Batdorf. I can give her information. She said direct any questions to her about specifics that go outside of what we do at the VA. So training someone not at the VA, or adaptations for youth, because outside of, 18 and 19, we don't see youth at the VA. So that isn't something that I necessarily know. So I will divert you to her, or pass you along to her. And she's incredibly helpful and lovely. So I definitely recommend reaching out to her.
That's great. I had a friend who was involved in a different part of the world of what I engage in, whose name was Backdorf. So that's a good start.
Yes.
We have a question. Once a safety plan is complete, who has access to it within the VA system? All VA providers, or just the clinician who completed it? And I think that's really important. There's a confidentiality issue here, and the person who you're meeting with as a clinician, they've got to trust you. So where does that one go?
Yep. So the safety plan in our chart at the VA is, so like technically it's able to be seen by anyone in the chart. But the way things work at the VA is I'm not allowed to just go into anyone's chart unless I'm working with them. And even when I'm in the chart, I'm also only supposed to be looking at the notes that are relevant to my work. So that's kind of how it plays in there with the chart itself. But it's not hidden. Whereas like the intimate partner violence safety plans, we don't document those because of the safety of the person. If someone were to get into that chart, and then their life would be at risk from someone seeing that. But with suicide prevention, we're trying to make this as much as everybody's business as possible. And so we're trying to get everybody involved, and how critical that's becoming, and knowing just how many folks have not been in recent mental health mental health treatment. And therefore we want to get as many people asking the questions at the VA as possible to be able to support them.
Yeah. It's incredibly important work. I just, from another involvement that I have with different nonprofits, there's a couple groups that are promoting gun locks. And it strikes me that gun locks make a lot of sense for what you're talking about, in terms of just, even though you know where the key is, it gives you that extra 30 seconds. So,
exactly.
Yeah.
Or you give the key to someone else, or you freeze the key in water in your freezer, so that you do, like, no one's taking your gun.
Yep.
But by the time that thing falls out, I can guarantee pretty much. No, I cannot guarantee.
Yeah, but it gives that extra time.
You got that time. You built in time and space.
Yeah. Wow. Well, this has just been really, really excellent. And I have to commend NAMI for finding you, because you really offered some great stuff. And I'm really glad. I want to commend the VA for focusing on this issue. It's a huge, huge issue. And
I appreciate so much that you guys had me here today. I want to shout about this intervention from the rooftops. Like, I want everyone to know it, whether they are a clinician and can do it, or they know of it, so they can point loved ones to the direction of a therapist who can do it. It's incredible.
Is there any serious delay in getting an appointment at the VA?
That totally depends on your location. So, like, Baltimore City is going to be very different than Perry Point, for instance.
Okay. Yeah.
But it's designed that you're supposed to be able to get your initial appointment, I believe, within 7 days. Now, that's still just an intake.
But that's okay.
So
sure,
then
it's a start.
It depends. I'm not going to say there's no delay.
And the VA serves just veterans or family members?
The VA serves veterans that they were discharged honorably. Some services are for other than honorable. And then some services, a lot of these emergent mental health options are now just for if you served, period.
Right. Okay.
You're eligible for emergency care.
Well, thank you so much for the work that you're doing. I think that's all the time we've got. So thank you very much. Thank all of the attendees. We started at 7, we went up to 10, as a matter of fact. So I think we had more people join us. At the end of the conference, those of you who were attending this, you'll receive a link for an evaluation survey.